Hi, everyone. I'm told this is a little glitchy. Let me just check here. Okay. Hi, so hope everybody's doing well. I am a professional philosopher, and that might sound kind of funny to you. I'm going to try to convince you that there are some virtues of practicing philosophy that are essential for living a meaningfully engaged form of life. So I know there are a lot of students and parents here today, and if I can convince at least one or two or a small handful of students to study philosophy, maybe in university, I fully acknowledge that that would probably upset at least some of the parents. Or if I can convince you to take a more philosophical approach to your life, I will have achieved my goal for the day. So I'm going to argue that doing philosophy is integral to certain forms of meaningful engagement with the activities that give life value. But I'm going to begin just by describing what it is that I think philosophers do, at least philosophers in the English language tradition that I was trained in. So people always ask me this when they learn that I'm a philosopher. They say, what exactly is it that you guys do all the time? This especially happens here in China. So people often say things like, but wait, aren't all the philosophers dead? Or they kind of scoff at me. They say, who do you think you are, Confucius? And honestly, that's fair enough. Philosophy is definitely associated with a lot of old, dead masters. And here in China, sort of the connection between those philosophers and the living descendant of traditional Chinese culture is very strong. But there are indeed living professional philosophers, probably more than you realize. So just as an example, in the United States, we can estimate, based on things like membership in the American Philosophical Association, plus the number of colleges and universities that there are, that there's somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 practicing professional philosophers in the United States right now. So divided into the American population, that's about 1 in every 16,000 people. So it's kind of rare. If you think of it as akin to a sort of affliction that just befalls you, it's about as rare as Lou Gehrig's disease. So what are all these people doing with their time? Well, here's a somewhat cliched answer that seems kind of appropriate for today's theme. And I think it sounds right. So they're seeking the truth. They're seeking the truth about certain fundamental things. The truth about what we know and how we know it. The truth about what's good and how we should live. The truth about what sorts of things there are in the world. So we get at these truths by asking questions like, what is knowledge? What makes an inquiry reliable? What things should we believe? What are right actions and what makes them right? How should we feel about certain people under certain conditions? What should I do now? What should I do with my life? Right? So these sets of questions, so I say they're fundamental because in a certain sense you can't go beyond them. If you start by asking about anything at all and you ask for reasons, eventually you're going to bump up against a question like this, a question that invokes a concept like goodness, or a concept like belief, a concept like maybe matter, or mind, or truth. So they're kind of bedrock in that sense. You can't get past them. So a lot of people don't believe in truth anymore. Maybe you've noticed this. They say things like, who are you to say what's true? Or, truth strikes me as kind of an oppressive concept. Right? They're worried about the abuse of the concept of truth. The worry seems to be that by making claims about what's true, we're improperly somehow imposing ourselves on others, or somehow disrespecting them. But this strikes me as a very deep mistake. So, without the idea of truth, so truth as a standard, more or less independent of what we already think, and the idea that there are better and worse ways of getting at it. There's nothing tethering our beliefs to the way things are in the world or with ourselves. So in our attempt at humility, we end up completely throwing out the idea that our beliefs are answerable to anything other than sentiment or convention. So we're trying to avoid certain unpleasant kinds of disagreement, but we undermine the very possibility of agreement itself when we throw out the concept of truth. So I also think it's a mistake to think that questioning someone's beliefs is a way of disrespecting them. So of course, there are disrespectful ways of going about questioning people's beliefs. But the act of questioning their beliefs is not itself disrespectful. And this might sound kind of counterintuitive, right? Because we're always taught to stay out of other people's business, to leave well enough alone, to not think we have the authority to tell people what they should think. But this is a mistake too, not least of all because questioning other people's beliefs simply doesn't require assuming any authority at all. It doesn't even involve assuming you have an answer to the question that you're asking. So if I ask you what you believe and why, it may just be because I want to know. So philosophers are some of the most curious and attentive listeners that I know of. Perhaps I can learn something from you. And we miss out on this completely if we don't ask questions of each other. So further, probing your beliefs, asking what you think and why, is not a sign of disrespect. If I ask you why you believe something, I'm assuming that you've thought it out, and you have good reasons for thinking as you do. And that strikes me as a much more charitable attitude to take towards you than I would if I assumed that you had no idea what you were talking about. Right? If I assume that you don't have any good reasons for believing as you do, and you can't articulate anything convincing to me. And if it turns out that you don't know what to say, and you're a little bit embarrassed, well, that teaches us something too, because it shows that we're all implicitly committed to this practice of believing things only for good reasons and doing things only for good reasons. That's why we feel embarrassment when we don't have a good answer to the question. So now, of course, I can't show, in the amount of time that I have, that there is this thing, the truth. And I probably haven't convinced most of you who were skeptical that it's not disrespectful of people to question their beliefs. I do happen to think these things are right, but the more pressing point for present purposes is actually the following. Even if you think they aren't right, that's not a way of impugning philosophy. That's just a way of doing philosophy. Right? The claim that truth doesn't exist, that's a philosophical claim. The claim that treating certain people in certain ways under certain conditions is to disrespect them, that's a philosophical claim too. So even when we try to undermine philosophy, sometimes we end up just doing it. We just engage in the very thing that we're trying to undermine the credibility of. So in that sense, that's one way in which philosophy is kind of inescapable. Here's another way. So philosophers aren't just interested in rounding up all the questions that we can ask about the world and then just answering them one at a time. Rather, we're interested in certain fundamental questions, right? Questions that somehow underlie all the other questions or organize domains of knowledge, kind of from the top down. And one way to see this is to sort of ask about the relationship between philosophy and science. So there's an old way of distinguishing between philosophy and science that goes like this. Science studies the way the world is. Philosophy studies the way the world ought to be. Now, there's something right about that, because the distinctively normative questions, questions about what's good or right or about how we should live, those are genuinely philosophical questions. But this can't be the whole story, because philosophical thinking bleeds into and penetrates scientific thinking a lot more than this would suggest. So modern science is kind of an amazing thing, right? It makes claims to knowledge about all these different domains of reality. So the biologists take care of the domain of living things, the physicists take care of the domain of kind of non-living material things, anthropologists, psychologists, sociologists, they study us. But eventually, the distinctive methodology of science runs out, right? The distinctive methodology of science is something like systematic observation-based testing. But just as an example, you can't use that methodology to find out what belief is. So think about the concept of belief for a second. What is it to believe something? Well, you can ask a psychologist that question. Some psychologists devote their lives to studying it. But psychologists are never going to learn through statistical correlation, right, which is their distinctive methodology, what belief really turns out to be. It just isn't the kind of thing that you learn by observing the world. Right? You don't go out into the world and say, there it is, I found it, at last, under that rock. Belief. Right? It's not that kind of thing. So the concept of belief is fundamental, in a certain sense, to all these different branches of psychology. But the ultimate nature of belief is not itself an object of psychological study. So, what is belief? Well, philosophers argue with each other about that, and they often discuss it with psychologists. And sometimes, when a philosopher has a good idea about how to model belief, it'll show up in a psychological experiment as a kind of operationalization, as they call it, of the concept of belief. So the boundary between philosophy and science can be hard to draw. The methodology of science runs out at a certain point, but the two activities are still continuous with each other. And this is especially true because of the way most English-speaking philosophers divide their labor. Right? So most philosophers these days, like scientists, specialize. So we try to avoid grand sweeping theories of everything, and we just stick to what we know. So we divide up the problems, and we focus closely on a sort of related class of them. And in a lot of cases, the problems are divided up in such a way that there's a lot of interaction between the philosophers who are working on one group of problems and some branch of science, sometimes several branches of science. So here's an example from my own work. So one of the things that I study is the nature of mental illness. In particular, I'm interested in what attitudes we should take, that is, how we should feel towards people who are in various kinds of abnormal psychological states. So people who suffer delusions, people who have personality disorders, people who have addictions, that kind of thing. So science on its own simply can't answer these questions, but it would obviously be foolish to try to answer them without consulting science. So the questions I've carved out for my research program just require that I have a good idea what our best science says about these various conditions. But it goes the other way too. Right? At a certain level, for example, theoretical neuropsychology just bleeds into philosophical. So if you want to do the theoretical neuropsychology of delusion formation, for example, or you can do that if you're a scientist, but questions, at a certain level, questions that those people have to answer just bleed into philosophical questions about the nature of rationality, motivation, belief itself. And the same thing happens to philosophers who are working at the edges of all sorts of other sciences, biology, climate science, physics, economics. So one reason philosophy is inescapable is because it bleeds into the edges of pretty much every science. But it also bleeds into the edges of pretty much everything else that we do. So whenever we do anything, when we act, deliberate, make a decision, even quickly and effortlessly, it always makes sense to ask about the reasons for which we did those things. Now, reasons are amazing things. The concept of a reason is another one of these fundamental things that you can't get at by doing science. So in one sense, reasons are just explanations. Right? If a doctor tests your deep tendon reflexes by hitting your leg with a reflex hammer and your leg straightens, we can ask, what is the reason that it did that? But the answer here doesn't involve appealing to a particularly interesting reason. The reason is just a cause. Right? It's just a physiological cause. That's one kind of reason, but sometimes we're interested in a different kind of reason. We're interested in reasons that justify what you do. When you straighten your leg as a result of being hit by the hammer, it's not really something that you properly perform as an action. It's more like something that happens to you. So it doesn't make sense to ask about whether it was justified for you to do that or not. But when you properly act, right, when you get up across the room to get the water, when you take the job, when you get married, when you move across the world, all of those things are done for reasons in this sort of second justificatory sense. Which means they're done because they reflect your best estimate of what you should do. So when we ask why you did something in this second sense, you can answer by citing what you want, or what you're trying to achieve, right? You want to make some money, or you want the water, or whatever. But a philosophical interlocutor will want to know, well, why do you want those things? Why are you trying to achieve that? Sometimes the answer is obvious. I want the water because I'm thirsty, end of story. But this isn't always true. Why do you want to make money? Why are you marrying that person? Right? These are perfectly sensible questions, and you can't escape them just by citing your desires, because it's manifestly possible to desire the wrong things. The mere fact that you want something isn't a good enough reason to pursue it. In that sense, desires can be mistaken. But if that's right, and desires are our basis for our actions, we'd better get clear about why we want the things that we want. So just as we can ask why a certain belief is justified or whether it's true, we can ask whether a certain desire is good. We want to know what values are reflected in your desires and whether they're the right ones. So in both cases, we're looking for rational reasons to believe or to desire or to act. And this is what strikes me as fundamental about the philosophical way of seeing the world. You want to make rational sense of what happens in it. The fragment of the world that contains human beings involves reasons explanations in this way. You want to know whether what people do and what they think is justified. So taking up this attitude strikes me as the solution to one of the biggest problems that we face in our lives. Right? We want the things that we do to have meaning. We want to genuinely engage in things that enrich our lives. One of the biggest regrets that a person can have is that they engaged in pursuits that turned out to be empty. And the best way to make sure that our pursuits are not empty is to ask after the rational reasons that underlie them. So when we do this, eventually we discover what it is that we most value. And we can take ownership of those values and allow them to guide our lives in the deepest way possible. So insofar as one of our deepest yearnings is to have a meaningful life, asking after these reasons and uncovering our values also seems inescapable. So in the theoretical domain, right, the domain of asking about how the world is, you're going to have to square with philosophy. You can't retreat to just doing science because the boundary isn't clear. In the practical domain, right, the domain of deciding what you should value, what you should pursue, you're going to have to square with philosophy there too, because if you want to act autonomously and take ownership of your reasons and your values, you have to ask after whether they're justified. So recognizing that this is true, this fact that philosophy is kind of unavoidable in this way, gives us another reason to think that questioning other people is not a sign of disrespect, but rather a sign of the highest concern. So we want our lives to have meaning, to be based on the pursuit of good things. But insofar as we care about others at all, we want the same things for them. We want to understand what motivates them, what they ultimately value. We want to make sense of them. This is a meaningful pursuit in its own right. Understanding somebody in this intimate way is valuable in itself. But it also reflects a deep form of caring, to want to know that the aspirations of the people that you care about are sound and well-founded, and that their desires are for the good. So you may have heard the story of Socrates, who was one of the founding figures in Western philosophy. He made a habit of walking around Athens refuting the putatively wise men of his day, and eventually the Athenians sentenced him to death for doing it. Plato makes this seem like a tragic story, that Socrates was unjustly treated. And I want to encourage you to think of it that way too. He wasn't disrespecting anybody. He was just doing what a good philosopher should do. So because of the way desires and beliefs condition action, concern about people translates into a concern that their lives are going well. And there's no more basic way of caring about somebody than that. So I've been claiming that whether you want to know what the world is like, or whether you want to live a good life, philosophy is inescapable. If that's true, then I suggest we simply embrace it. Thank you.